So when I talk about intersections, I like to keep it really simple. A lot of times when I'm talking to a group of parents or a group of decision makers that don't have much background in this, and I try to simplify it as much as I can for them so that as they're looking at decisions, hopefully they get to a place where they feel comfortable making some of those. So I really only talk about 3 components when we're talking about just intersections, especially for pedestrians, and that's shorten the crossing distance, improve the visibility, and slow the vehicle speed, and various strategies that you can use to do that. I don't have every one in here, so as we go along, if there's another one of you knows about that you'd like to mention, feel free to do that. I've got the sections kind of broken up, so maybe right when we get to the end of this section, I'll ask if other people have other strategies for that particular thing that they like to use. So quickly, why do this? There's a lot of reasons, but awareness that this is to indicate this is a preferred walking location, alert drivers that there's going to be folks there, and indicate to the walkers that this is the preferred route for them. So you're indicating to both drivers and walkers. It's not just one or the other. And of course, at the end of the day, you're trying to improve safety. Some of you have seen this already. Obviously, if you get hit at 40 miles an hour, you probably aren't going to live. If you get hit at 20, you probably are. That's the long and short of it. I have a sister who got hit by a car at the corner of Myrtle and Capitol Boulevard, for those of you who live in Boise, about 3 years ago. And we think the car was going about 30. And it's sure a good thing, because she almost died anyway. She had a really traumatic head injury. She broke her hip and also had a knee injury. So speed can make a tremendous difference, and I'm pretty sure if that car had been going very much faster, she wouldn't be with us. So it's become even more important to me. Braking distance, besides the speed of getting hit, if you're going a lot faster, of course, it takes you longer to brake. So if you see somebody, you're not going to get stopped, or you might if you're going a little bit slower. So keep it simple. Shorten the crossing distance. What are the various ways you can use to shorten the crossing distance? Of course, one of the main ones that is beginning to be used is doing different islands and curb extensions and things at the intersection that put the pedestrian closer to their destination across the street before they even begin the walk. Curb extensions, the typical ones are bulb outs at the corner itself. Of course, you saw this one, which is kind of atypical, but also a really good one, I think, because it's got the landscaping in it, which also cues drivers that there's something else going on here that's a little bit different. But the typical ones with just the curb itself extended out and the ramps at each of the corners really can shorten the distance. This is downtown Pocatello. About 2 years ago, they did curb extensions in a 4 square block area, two blocks wide, actually 2 by 4 area. And they've seen a marked increase in business traffic since then, walking traffic to their businesses. I don't have the numbers. I called the mayor yesterday to see if he had any updated numbers, but they did have a lot of vacancies on Main Street before they did this, and those vacancies are way down since this opened. Another way you can shorten crossing distance is to change the curb radii. So how wide is that corner? Of course, the wider it is, the faster the cars can go around it, and the longer distance it creates for the pedestrians. A lot of times folks don't think about how the curb radii actually works. If you have a street with on-street parking and a bike lane on both corners, which this one does, even if you have a curb itself, which is relatively narrow, that's still a pretty wide curb radii. That's the effective one. So for those of you who are engineers in the room, it's not just the curb itself and what that concrete, the curve on the concrete is, it's what is the effective radius of where the car movement, turning movement is going to be. Median islands, so putting an island in the middle of the street is also a great way to shorten distance. This visual also shows chicanes, which I didn't call out. There's a couple of, that isn't necessarily a shorten the crossing distance, but the chicanes do slow the traffic, which we talk about later. There's two-stage median islands, and these are typically used on higher speed roads. We have a couple in this region. Let's see, Apple. They're putting one on State Street. They don't have it yet. Anyway, what this does is it directs you, so as you're crossing the street, you only have to cross the lanes of traffic that are coming to your left. So you cross, 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 you get to that middle, and the fence forces you to turn and look at the traffic that you're then going to cross next. So the reason it's called two-stage is because the design of it forces you to actually turn and look at the traffic that's coming at you. So it both shortens the traffic distance and increases visibility. So other ways to shorten the crossing distance that you guys know about or have used. Anybody? Any ideas? Okay, I just want to make sure. Like I said, I'm not trying to be completely comprehensive here, but
roundabout gets shorter crossing distances.
Yeah, yeah. Roundabouts are a great way. At each corner of the roundabout, it's a shorter crossing distance. Now, the overall distance that you travel is a little bit longer, but on some roads, that's really an advantage.
I guess something I think of is just new developments as they go in. I often feel like they put in a highway into a neighborhood. Just how large of a footbed does the neighborhood road have, or whatever it is?
So,
I mean, that can be mind-blowing.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is the road section that is put into new development is whatever your particular jurisdiction requires in their own standards. There's minimums and maximums in the AASHTO Safety Highway Green Book, but and FHWA has various standards here and there. Many standards are adopted as the maximum, and then that becomes the minimum. So for instance, on a residential road, for those of you who know, how many require 36 feet back of curb to back of curb? Do you know? Anybody? We do here in most cases, and that's really wide. 33 feet or 32 feet with parking on both sides is an acceptable standard and can create a lot nicer feel. If it's a new subdivision that has all driveways and very little parking on the street, that 36 feet becomes actually the travel lanes in most cases, and not just the distance of the full pavement, and so that's why it makes it so wide. So advocating, go look and see what your standard is in your community, and if it's 36 feet on Residential Street, I would suggest that's too wide, and that you could advocate to lower that to 33 or 32. You had something?
Well, sure. I was just thinking about a project or a street in Boise here that I know of that's very wide, just exactly what you described, and residential, lots of bike ped use on it, discontinuous or sidewalk, lots of gaps, and it doesn't, how do you get attention for that road when I know 13th has got a study going on, PCHD, so to do a road diet on that road and to do some things for bike and peds. So how does a community get attention for another road that doesn't have as much traffic?
That's again, depending on who your local folks are, if it's this region and it's ACHD that controls your roadways, they do have a very specific process that you have to go through to get attention. And that process requires you to go to all your neighbors with a petition, and if you get 75% of them to sign it, then ACHD will take a look at your road. In most communities, so in my other life, I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm here representing Idaho Smart Growth. In my other life, I'm a city council member in Boise. In most communities, if you go and raise havoc with your decision makers, they'll listen to you. I can tell you that. So you want to get attention? Go make them pay attention.
I thought they did a good job, ACHD, on spelling out the process to get road diet on your neighborhood.
Yeah, I was going to say, on the other hand, having criteria is a good thing because then it isn't just the squeaky wheel that gets attention, but it's actually folks who need it. So the other thing I would say, and you know, if you want to just do a little bit of fun stuff on your own, this isn't shortening crossing distance, but it certainly reduces speed. We did a little experiment a couple of, probably a decade ago now at Idaho Smart Growth with a group of folks who live on such a road that's, it's a collector, it's a little wide, nobody parks on it really a little bit, so it seems even wider than it was. And we asked any of them if they had an old trailer or they had anything that they were willing to park on the street, knowing that people were going to travel fast, and see what the impact would be. Well, one of the guys who was very skeptical decided he'd try it because he was so skeptical he thought there's no way in the world this would work. And so he did have a trailer, and his daughter, in fact, was raising pumpkins and had some for sale. So he put all the pumpkins in the trailer and lowered the gate and had a big sign, "Pumpkins for sale," and lo and behold, everybody slowed down. So there are organic things that you can do too, and in a more organized way, that's called tactical urbanism, and folks are doing it all over the country to see to experiment with things that aren't necessarily approved roadway treatments, but certainly organically can be things that happen anyway, and see what impact they have. So there you go. Okay. Improve visibility of and at crossings. So for me, there's two things about visibility. One is that you want the pedestrian or the bicyclist, if it's a bicyclist, to be visible, but you also want the vision triangle of that intersection to be visible. Sometimes the two things work against each other. I showed you, well, this right here. So here's a big island. It has pretty tall grasses in it. And in one way that impacts visibility, in another way it tells drivers, oh, there's something there, I need to look for it. So you have to be a little bit careful with this, but visibility, I think, is a really important factor. There are approved and appropriate traffic control measures that you can use, and we'll talk about some of those. And there's others, like we talked about, that are more experimental, that certainly are worth trying, and talked about those in the last session as well. So marked crosswalks, there's ways to do marked crosswalks. There's various kinds of signs and flashers and warnings, and then there's, of course, stop signs and traffic signals and various ways to use those. So the crosswalk itself, what makes it visible? We've learned a lot in the last little while, and in a lot of places, at least in the urban areas around the state, we're beginning to use more visible ones. But just an example of what happens when it's not. So this is the typical old style crosswalk. It's called traverse markings. It's just the two lines across the road. And I'm the pedestrian here. I'm going to walk across the street. It looks to me like people have been told that that's a place for me to cross, and I'd be okay. That's what the driver sees. Not very visible, and it's actually just out of the shadow, so it's pretty crazy how little those show up. This isn't a great exact comparison, but here's a higher visibility kind of crosswalk, again just past the shadow, and how much more visible that is. So crosswalk markings are the first thing. There's three sort of typical styles. The traverse ones, The other thing about the traverse ones is that the paint just wears out because it's crosswise to the tire movement and doesn't take very long for it to get worn off. And then there's the Continental one, which is just the markings like you saw in this photo. And those are very visible, and in a even more in an area where you want even more visibility, you can add the traverse markings to the Continental and create a ladder, and sometimes it's appropriate to do that. This is changing a bit. It used to be that the ladder style was becoming preferred, but actually the Continental style is beginning to be the preferred style. It's typically at least as visible as you need, and like I said, if you put those traverse markings on, they wear off anyway.
Also, in the last frame, I saw that there were some yellow caution stripes before the crosswalk. Is that just also another identifier that?
So this one does have the pedestal. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the other identifiers in just a minute. Perfect. You can raise the crosswalk. So what does that do for visibility? That puts the pedestrian up higher, and the higher they are, the more visible they are, especially if they're children. So I do a lot of works with Safe Routes to School, which is why that logo is also on here. And especially if you're dealing with kids in a place where there's a lot of kids and there's a crosswalk that isn't being paid attention to, it can be really effective to raise it on a table. This one also, of course, has the brick marking, and so that makes it even more visible because it's a different color. The two of those together can be really effective. Yeah.
At night, red is black. And so, to a driver, that is not visible, even though the pedestrian thinks it is. The white reflective lines are, but using red concrete, red brick, thinking, oh, we're making it more visible, doesn't.
Depends on whether it's reflective or not, and some of it now is with the thermal.
Reflective in the roadway.
Is that true? I thought that was not true.
Yeah, the markings, you do want the retroreflective, correct, with the lateral lines.
Yeah.
Those are required per the METCD.
Right, but you can't do reflective yellow, your bricks can't be reflective, it's just the white that's reflective, right?
Correct. Yeah, if you're referring to different types of patterns within the crosswalk, yeah, there's specific memo with regards to what is allowed and what's not.
Okay.
Because a lot of agencies are getting very clever or very creative, which can cause confusion. So yeah, there is the manual of uniform traffic control devices that agencies do need to follow.
Yeah, yeah.
But I've only read a couple of studies that show that red doesn't add safety, particularly at night for pedestrians.
Well, that's a great point. This one actually isn't red, it's yellowish and brownish, and it probably does show up a little bit more, but that's a really great observation that Go ahead.
You talk about lighting as well. I think that's the other aspect.
Yeah.
It's more aesthetics thing, but you should really have lighting at the crosswalk.
Yeah.
I was wondering, just from an ADA perspective, so there's not really anything differentiating the sidewalk from the street.
Yeah.
So what is the identifier to somebody who's...
Well, this one, it does have the brick to the smooth, but you're absolutely right, it doesn't have truncated domes, and it should from an ADA perspective. So.
But
Yeah, you're not going to be able to use that one
Like
anymore.
if this is a urban approach, that's not an intersection. So if this is a driveway, then it wouldn't, because a blind pedestrian would approach the domes and they'd stand there waiting to cross the street when there was no street.
This is a pathway crossing a street, so it actually, even though it looks like it is in this case, I think, considered an intersection. So ADA, as you pointed out, what's wrong with this picture? This is a roadway adjacent to and leading to one of the schools in our region, and I think they finally fixed it last year. But as you can see, it doesn't have doesn't have appropriate markings here, and once you get across the street, you're on a desire trail instead of an actual sidewalk. So, yeah, it's in a little one of the smaller communities, more rural. So what do you do about this? Obviously, truncated dome with an actual concrete apron. These domes can be bright yellow, as you've seen. I showed the red one on purpose because a lot of people don't know that they can also be red. To your point, in terms of visibility, it's probably less visible to drivers if it's red, but it's certainly because it's the texture of it. If you're, visually disabled, you certainly know it's there. Two curbs at the corner. We talked about that briefly with curb extension, but even if you don't have a curb extension, it's always best practice to do two curbs at the corner, two curb cuts and ramps. If you don't, first of all, you'd see that this one would dump right into the middle of a drainage, which I've seen happen more than once. They put a curb cut and nice truncated dome, and then there's a drain. And sometimes anymore, people are smart enough to avoid that. But the other most important thing is then that puts you right into the turning traffic. You're right in the middle of where the traffic is trying to turn. So having the two curb cuts so that you can have the straight instead of a more diagonal path is always best practice.
And a blind friend says that points him in the right direction.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, you're not pointed out diagonally across the intersection. That was not supposed to say overhead signage. I'm sorry, I don't know why that says that. Anyway, signage. So these are usually pedestals in the road, and I should have had this animated so I could ask you what's the state law in Idaho, but how many knew that the state law in Idaho is yield and not stop? Okay. So the reason different states have different laws, the reason I'm pointing this out is that you treat then the intersection a little bit differently. So first of all, you have to use the appropriate pedestal if you do put a pedestal in the intersection. So in this case, you'd use the yield one. Oh, sorry. Okay, we do have these. Secondly is how you treat people who are approaching the intersection. So there's a couple of things to learn here. If you have a two lanes of traffic traveling one direction, and you have a crosswalk with no stop bar or no stop indicator, and that first car pulls right up, then the second one has no visibility of the pedestrian, obviously. One way to impact that is to put a stop bar or a yield bar back here so that this car has plenty of time to see the pedestrian before they cross. And here's the appropriate signs that you use for those two things. So in the case of a stop, which Idaho isn't, you can do the line, or in a place where there's a stop sign, you can do the line with the stop bar. But in the case of a yield to pedestrian, which in most cases where there's not a stop sign, Idaho is, you use the shark teeth or this advanced yield sign. Parking restrictions near crosswalks are really important. How many of you have had to look around the car to see if anybody's coming? Yeah? You don't want to do that, so restricting the parking, especially on the downstream side of that intersection, can be really important. Traffic signal guidelines, so in addition to just streets that have just stop signs and those kinds of markings on them, we have a lot of streets that have actual traffic signals, and there's various things you can do to help the pedestrian be safer when there's a signaled crossing. So we've already talked about the stop bars. We'll talk about you should have pedestrian signals in all directions unless there's been a conscious decision not to do one. For some reason, there's occasionally an intersection where it's best to do that. And you want to mark all of the crosswalks where there are pedestrians. We're going to talk about the adequate crossing time for pedestrians. Does anybody, what is the latest? Has it changed again? The latest standard I knew was 3.5 seconds per foot. Is that right? Okay. So you measure the distance of the crosswalk, and that's how many seconds you give.
Lynn, you said that, you know, in Idaho it's yield to pedestrians on a crosswalk. What is the law, like if there's somebody in the crosswalk, do they have to be stopped for the entire time that they walk all the way across? Or does that yield make a difference on when they can go past a pedestrian who's in a crosswalk?
If it's a 2-lane road, you're supposed to wait till they get curb to curb. If it's a 4-lane, again, my memory on this one might be a little off. My memory is if it's a 4-lane, you have to wait till they clear the lanes going your direction. Is anybody different than that?
There is actually a website that does all the state laws, and some states even.
Yeah, I know.
The yields explain whether you have to stop on your side of the road or whether you have to clear the entire road. So
Yeah.
but really whether yield or stop, you're supposed to stop.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about the length.
The length of time.
Everyone doing it differently, and I'm just curious.
Well, and that's why I'm confused, because there are some local laws in Idaho that are different than the state laws, and I apologize, I can't remember exactly. Erin?
I wonder if it's a local law in Knoxville, but what the PD has told us repeatedly is that you only have to stop or yield to pedestrians that are in your lane. And once the pedestrian has cleared your lane, traffic can freely move while they finish their cross. I don't think it's safe, I'm just saying that's what they say.
I think that may be the state law in Idaho,
Drop something.
and we have local laws that are different. Yeah, yeah.
I asked the police chief, he'd catch a former police chief, and he didn't know. He had
Yeah.
to go back. So,
So that's actually good to know. That's something that we can bring up as an organization, and so can Cynthia, and we can look into it, see if we can clarify that. So another thing that you can do to minimize conflicts for pedestrians is, one of the biggest conflicts for pedestrians, and this is how my sister got hit, is when you have right turning traffic and a crosswalk. And you know, pedestrian thinks, man, I'm safe, I got this walk light, and off they go, and somebody comes around the corner and clips them. So if you have a concurrent signal, as soon as the crosswalk signal, the walk signal, and the green light turn at exactly the same moment. And so I'm getting the green light to go just at the same time the pedestrian's getting the signal that they should go. If you have a leading pedestrian interval on your light, and we can actually look at one on our walk if you'd like to, at the corner of Capitol and Main Street, or Idaho Street, the pedestrian signal turns, the light is still red for a number of seconds, depending on how wide the road is, how fast the traffic is. You can make that lead interval 2 or 3 seconds. So what this does then is let the pedestrian get out where they're visible to the car that might be turning before that car gets the green light. Countdown pedestrian signals are becoming best practice in most places. How many of you in communities outside of Boise are using those? Starting to, so that's good. We should, I think, to me, that's one of the things I'd like to advocate for the most as signals get changed out. I think that countdown signal, it's actually good for drivers too. Drivers know, how they can prepare to stop, or some of them prepare to speed through, but a lot of people prepare to stop because they know it's going to turn. The other thing that you can do when you have a countdown signal is really understand how long it takes for people to cross, and you have to think about it. And if you get it wrong, you can change it, but it makes it really visible for everyone to do it. I'll often go out on a walk on it and take my cell phone nowadays and time the signal, how long, and then measure the intersection and what are they basing it on. And often it will be less than the 3.5 feet per second. And so in that case, then I can tell whether it's the city or county or whoever controls that roadway, hey, did you know that this signal isn't really adequate for someone to cross the street if they're not a fast walker? No, I didn't know that. Having the countdown signal also tells the walker, oh, I better hurry up, or I can't start because there's not enough time to get across. Anyway, having those countdown signals can be really good, and then being able to modify the traffic signal timing depending on conditions. So around schools, even though the standard is 3.5 feet per second, you can make it longer than that so that the kids have more time to cross, because often they'll arrive at school and they're talking, they're doing whatever, they're not paying attention. And that can be a really great thing. If you're next to a location where there's folks who have disabilities or other ambulatory issues, and it's going to take them a long time to get across almost every time, you can adjust the timing for that one as well. When there isn't good visibility for that pedestrian, it's good practice to not allow that right turn on red. And especially important, I think, the ones that we see around here the most, and many of you don't have as many of the freeway interchanges, but we now have a lot of pedestrians on our freeway interchanges because often they're the only bridge over the freeway. And at almost all of those now we have the no right turn on red, because that's really a big conflict point. People aren't thinking about pedestrians, they've just traveled fast. But anywhere where it's a high-speed road, or you think that people won't notice a pedestrian, you can do this. Rectangular rapid flashing beacons were in, and then they were out, and now they're in again. They do show to have a high compliance rate over other kinds of treatments, because they flash so visibly. Do all of you know what one of those looks like? Have you seen them in action? They're like the strobe on the back of a police vehicle. And so they do really work well. However, they're being misused in some places because they're being used on roads that are too big for them. They really shouldn't go on a 4-lane road or a road that has high truck traffic. For those, you want something different. Well, here's an example of a rapid flashing beacon. This one has shortened crossing distance and the beacon, so this one is really a great treatment. And then for a busier road where you need more attention, a hawk signal. How many of you have hawk signals in your communities? So you know how they work. They start out flashing yellow, and then they go to red, and that's when you're supposed to be stopped, and then they wigwag red. And when they're wigwagging, if the pedestrian has cleared the lane or the direction, then you can proceed, even if the pedestrian is still present. We do a lot of work on schools, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different things that also go on around schools. These are also best practices for places where there is high conflict between cars and pedestrians, and a lot of pedestrians present. Advanced warning signs that there's a pedestrian crossing ahead, that's always a great one. For a lot of school zones, if there's not a lot of compliance, if you get some of these flashers, people are much more likely to comply. In this region, we use those particularly on 4-lane roads where there are schools. During school hours, they have the flashers going. You can do the flashers on overhead as well, and on a bigger road that's more effective and more visible. And okay, that's the end of traffic signal, traffic control stuff. Anybody else have other ones that you know of that have been effective that you've used?
Question on rapid flashing beacons. They flash yellow, right?
Yes.
Does that mean you're just supposed to slow and yield to pedestrians?
Yeah.
You have to stop necessarily?
You don't necessarily have to stop, depending on where you are when they're crossing, and depending on whether or not they've cleared. I always wait for them to clear the direction I'm going in, or if it's a 2-lane road, I wait for them to clear the entire road.
Yeah, basically, it follows the same as a sign in a crosswalk. It's just that they have to clear your side of the roadway based on your law. You're just letting them know that there's a pedestrian they're wanting to cross.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
there's
it's,
the Federal Highway Interim Approval 21. Interim Approval 11 is out, so you do need to apply for 21. The individual cities, Idaho did not do a statewide application.
oh, they didn't?
No.
Okay, I thought they were going to, sorry. Hear that, darn.
Could you clarify, I've always understood that even if there's not a painted crosswalk, if there's a
Yeah.
corner to corner, that's a pedestrian's right to cross the road there?
So in Idaho state law, if there is an intersection, it doesn't even have to be a 4-legged intersection. If there's an intersection on a road, that is a legal place for a pedestrian to cross the road without being picked up for jaywalking. And as a driver, your responsibility is to yield to that pedestrian. We're a yield state. Now, you know, on a high-speed highway, it's often not effective as a pedestrian just step out and assume they're going to yield to you, but legally you have the right to do that. So what we suggest is that on high-speed roads, if there are a lot of pedestrians present, that you do pick frequent and many crossings and get them marked and let drivers know to expect those pedestrians there. A lot of roadway agencies tell you that they don't want frequent crossings, so there's, you know, between those who advocate for pedestrian bike facilities and those who advocate for car travel speed, there's often a conflict between that, but at least, I don't even like to say this, at least a 1/4 mile between crossings. We have many, many high-speed roadways in our urban area that have a 1 or 2 mile distance between marked crossings. And what ends up happening is that people just cross then wherever and whenever they can, and creates a lot of issues, a lot of problems. But legally, if there's an intersection there, that's a place that you can cross. And that's, you know, for me, that's another kind of, it's not a gray area in the law. Actually, it's pretty clear to me in the law, but in this region, we've had 3 or 4 pedestrian collisions, 2 of which were fatal, that occurred where there was a intersection but not a marked crosswalk, and the police report said the pedestrian was crossing outside of a crosswalk, and blamed the pedestrian for the accident. And legally, that's not the case in Idaho law. So creating safe places for them to cross, I think, in my estimation, is really important.
Not so much anymore, but when I first started working on these things, there was some thinking among some of our engineers that no crosswalk painted was safer than one that's painted because it gives pedestrians a false sense of security.
Well, if all you do, yeah.
How do you?
If all you do is paint a crosswalk, especially traverse lines like that one I showed in Atlanta, then you're right. You're only creating a false sense of security, and that's why we talk about all the other things.
And really, that's where federal highways under the Everyday Count STEP initiative, if you type in EDC STEP, S-T-E-P, that goes into what's called a Zagier study, and then we have a new guide that sort of talks about the different types of crossing treatments, many that referred to here, as to what's appropriate. Because what you're talking about, the false sense of security, is based upon a 1970s study, the Herm study, which is really out of date.
Right.
That's why the Zagier study came up, and then we've got all these new guidance and recommendations for agencies. So Everyday Count STEP initiative is really trying to get engineers to understand that concept, because it's based upon ADT and the number of lanes.
Yeah.
So it's just EDT,
EDC.
Everyday counts.
Everyday counts.
C step?
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
and I think a key message from the STEP study is at lower volumes of traffic, a crosswalk is great and fine, and why not do it? Because it makes sense. You hit a certain volume threshold, a crosswalk by itself is insufficient. If you want to provide a crossing opportunity, you have to do something more. And that's where something like a pedestrian hybrid beacon or a rectangular rapid flashing beacon is great, because you can do those and still not interfere with the intersection timing along the corridor,
Right.
except when, you know, the pedestrian just happens to be there and crossing.
Right, right. And then if you pair those with pedestrian refuge islands or the two-step crossing, you know, as the volumes go up and the speed goes up, there's various more treatments that you probably want to introduce.
The one other treatment as far as signals is the flashing yellow, which some cities now, and they are designed where when they're pedestrian activated, it can go to a protected phase, so it doesn't have a flashing yellow, it's a red arrow.
Oh, okay.
So then the pedestrians can cross without that conflict of the vehicles taking the left.
Oh, that's
So
great.
it works great for getting the vehicles through when there's not pedestrians, but when a pedestrian does activate it,
Then
then
it
it
goes to red.
arrow.
Okay. So you guys all know what he's talking about with the flashing yellow turn? Yeah.
One of the challenges, I think, with the pedestrian hybrid beacon is the two things. One is the turning driver that's coming up to the intersection that's not on that.
Yeah.
That's the T in there. They can't see the light, but they see the traffic is stopped. So that's an adult looking at that. Number two is that those are found a lot of times in school zones. If we were at one at Maple Grove last week. I think it was Maple Grove.
For Lake Hazel Middle School.
Lake Hazel Middle School. So we've got middle schoolers crossing, and they told us, you know, we only have a few seconds before it turns again. And so we went out and watched it, we timed it. And what I noticed, and I noticed this on the Pioneer Corridor too, is that a pedestrian hybrid beacon is unlike any other pedestrian crossing in that you've got the flashing yellow, slows the traffic down, the solid reds come on, and you have about 8 seconds or so before then these yellow or the red lights start to flash back
To wag.
and the countdown timer starts. So if we are training children or adults to have a walk signal in any other situation, we know that those lights are solid red. There's no chance that that driver will go through that.
Yeah.
And in these cases, the driver is stopping, supposed to stop, then proceed forward if safe to do so. And we're seeing people failing to yield, failing to stop, and the kids don't understand. You see the countdown timer, they're running across the road because they're trying to make the light. And how do you train that out of somebody who's being trained by every other light in the whole city?
That the countdown signal means it's still solid red.
The countdown means it's solid red. It's stopped.
Yeah.
Why can't we have that be what a pedestrian hybrid beacon is? That is very important for our youth crossing behavior.
Well, basically then you're saying you're going to a signal.
It is a signal.
Well, it's a beacon. No, it's a beacon.
It's a traffic signal, though. You're stopping traffic.
You are, but that's why they call it a hybrid beacon, because at a signal, if it's blanked out, they've got every vehicle has to stop, even if there's not pedestrians there.
Right.
So what you're referring to, though, is the children, they're supposed to be looking at the pedestrian signal and the countdown, right?
Right.
They can't see whether it's flashing or
They
not.
don't even understand what
Right, and that's not for them to,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really the responsibility of the driver.
Yeah.
That they're supposed to stop, and if there's no pedestrians there, they can proceed, but otherwise they're supposed to be stopped.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you have a school situation where a lot of these are based, you have people, we watch the scooters coming, we watch the bikes coming, we watch kids sprinting to try to make light because they know that their delay is longer than they want to wait. That takes a while for it to activate because it's working with this light down here and this light up here. So it's working as a system to keep the main traffic flow going. So it's not like any other thing, and it just seems so incorrect to me to have that countdown timer that is the same as any signal.
So what you're saying is that the car traffic is not obeying the signal to stop when it's wagging.
Yeah, it's written up there, but do you have time to read that as a driver? I mean, you got all this other stuff going on.
Well, that might be where some target enforcement might be helpful.
Yeah.
Some community education. And then also, you know, if you're concerned about how people are responding, because it's, you know, we haven't had this traffic control device for an extended period of time, and we might learn more. You know, can you get your traffic engineer out there and watch what you're seeing and show them, okay, because the countdown signal comes up, the kids don't understand what's happening, and they're behaving in a way that we're not wanting them to happen, and there might be something they can do with the timing to fiddle with it as well. So there's sort of a three-pronged effect. And I agree, there's a lot of people that they see the wig wag, and maybe you know, once the first car has gone through, a lot of them don't stop and then proceed.
Yeah.
And it may take a generation before people fully understand that.
Like, this is loss of our generation, piece of
So do you think it
Yeah.
would be better actually to not have the countdown almost?
I would like it to be solid red, treat it as a signal, that will help in a school zone. That's where we're seeing those issues, make it a signal. I mean, those are long distances, usually put it in places where it's a long distance in the next crossing area.
Mhm.
And that's where the trade-offs get higher, because sometimes having a full signal makes it more difficult to.
It's because of how signals are treated with the rest of the system versus how a beacon is treated with the rest of the system. So it seems like the first solution to try would be the enforcement and playing with the timing on the countdown. But education, I think, you know, we ignore education in our culture. We assume everyone knows. We don't test drivers anymore. We assume everyone knows, and they don't.
Kids don't drive.
Well, I'm not talking about the kids. I'm talking about the drivers. The kids would be perfectly safe if the drivers were behaving appropriately. So I'm talking about educating the drivers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have this eroded sense that kids need to do the right thing, and when we fail to recognize that they don't drive a car.
Yeah.
We see that over and over. They're blamed for those things.
Yeah.
And it makes my work really super hard.
Yeah.
Well, and the comment I thought you were going to make about it was that the kids aren't activating it. And, you know, certainly with rectangular rapid flashing beacons, the middle schoolers are too cool to push the button. And so, you know, locations where they observe that type of thing happening, they've actually set it up so that during the release times, they have it automatically go.
They just have it go.
So, you know, sometimes, you know, we run into these little cultural issues because children respond differently in the built environment than adults do. You're very right.
Drew?
Just a couple things. I guess first, to back up kind of what Lisa was saying, Boise State has a couple good examples of that. There's a hybrid beacon on Chrisway and University Drive.
Right.
You see that frequently. So where once it starts doing the wigwag, it's more of a rolling stop than a solid stop. But then the new Z crossing, one of the best examples of a Z crossing is on Island Avenue when they put it on Capitol Boulevard. And on the northbound side, there's no intersection, but they decided to do a full signal there. You don't see any of that. So it's definitely kind of this middle thing with drivers that if it's a green, yellow, red, they're not going to roll through.
Yeah.
It's a psychological thing that they're running around.
Is it a full signal that's pedestrian activated on Highland?
Yes.
So I guess that's potentially a solution.
And then the other thing I was going to ask you if you've ever, kind of similar to the middle school thing, but we struggle with that too, and ways to encourage use of equipment that requires interaction. We just put in some RFBs, and was it saying 8 out of 10 pedestrians don't push the button?
Yeah.
And just go straight into the crosswalk. So I don't know what methods may.
Well, so can I tell you on myself, I don't push if I look and I know I can make it, I don't push the button because I don't see any reason to stop the traffic.
Yeah.
You know?
Passive detection is to be used as well.
Yeah, but
Talking about like sensors, motion sensors.
so one of the issues here, and it just occurred to me with this conversation, we went to the hybrid beacons because on a full signal you have to have a green light when it's not red, when it's not activated. And it used to be keeping that light green all year cost $7,500 in electricity. With LEDs, it doesn't cost that anymore, so maybe it is worth a review. I hadn't really, until now, thought about that. Go ahead.
And so thank you for stating that. Actually, the pedestrian hybrid beacon, it's called a beacon specifically because it doesn't, there's guidelines in the MUTCD, those are not warrants. So that minimum of 20 pedestrians per hour, it is actually a guide. Okay, so if you have less than that, and you can, as engineers, so you can say, we're going to get more pedestrians as we put this in, then you can justify it. So signals they have the warrants, but the pedestrian hybrid beacons is just a guide. Okay?
Yeah.
So that should be very clear to everybody because a lot of places they're saying we don't want to put them in just because they don't meet warrants, but they're not on warrants.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the beacons is it on University, like by the engineering and the rec center, or is that where you guys are putting them in and they're not using the buttons?
It's by the student union, by the new Sawtooth Hall, the Honors College facility.
I think a lot of that's because that's a really great street section, and people feel comfortable walking in it, and it's a people first area.
That's part of the problem. You have the east section of University Drive that's 2 lanes with the center turn aisle, and you have the state law beat.
The pedestals,
And you in that section you have that mentality, that mindset, but then the western portion of University Drive goes into 2 lanes and a turn lane, and it's a whole different.
And there's a blind corner there. So people are walking.
So we better get through this last section so we have time for our walk. But this is great discussion. I appreciate it. Any others on this? Did somebody else have their hand up?
The comment I was going to make was about the pedestrian beacon. So like over by the Compass office, where there's the one by City Hall and Meridian, City Hall there, going on Meridian Road, that the turning traffic off Broadway sees that beacon go on and then uses that opportunity to
turn
out into traffic.
Yeah.
And, so, if you have a pedestrian that forgets something.
So the cross traffic is using it as a signal for themselves. Yeah. But, and in that case, there probably is at this point warrants. But, you make a great point that if you don't have a warrant for a full signal, you can still put one of these. So we're still learning, aren't we? So slowing traffic down. So here we are. We have these signs. We have the refuge island in the middle, and these kids are still running. Why do you think? Because the traffic isn't very slow there. So you can still do all of this stuff in the traffic. If the traffic isn't paying attention, isn't driving at a lower speed, we'll still have a lot of problems. This really is effective. One of the things you can do is get one of the electronic speed signs. And even if you have ones that you can move around, it just reminds drivers to pay attention to their speed. As a city council member, I get asked all the time, well, why don't you just enforce more? If you just go out there and enforce more, everything would be fine. And easy to say until you have to add 10 patrol officers in order to do that. And then how do you figure out how to make that work? It's also, one would hope that speeding, if we accept culturally that it's okay to speed, then everybody speeds. And so it's partly a cultural thing. If everybody slows down, then even those speeders feel uncomfortable speeding. So if you just rely on somebody else to do it for you, sometimes for me, I think that that's maybe not the right solution. So this is one of those things that culturally reminds you, oh, I'm not supposed to speed here, and seems to be pretty effective. So you can reduce the lane width just with paint and just the visual change. Imagine if this didn't have paint. So this lane would be, about 15 feet wide with the paint. Although that pedestrian is really not in a safe, protected place, at least they feel, the driver feels like they're not supposed to be over there. And it's less likely that people wander over. So you have to be careful with this because you don't want to put pedestrians, especially kids, in a vulnerable place where they're not safe. But on the other hand, it does work typically to slow drivers down if it's narrow enough. If it's only a 12-foot distance, if this is still 12 feet, probably not going to slow down at all because they're not going to feel that that's a little bit more narrow than what they're comfortable in. But if it's 11 or 10 and a half, they start to feel a little bit more uncomfortable in it, and they tend to slow down a bit. So you have to be careful where you put those lane widths because of the other kind of traffic that may be using the road, but typically in an urban area, 10 and a half feet is plenty of width for the vehicles, especially in this case where you have the slop if you need it, if you have a oversized vehicle. So we'll go back to curb extensions because in addition to shortening distance, they do reduce speed. If something's out in the middle of the roadway that you can see, it's going to make you, as a driver, more aware that something's up there. and then the chicanes as well. So you can see in this case there's a tree on that curb extension. That does even more because you've got the vertical element that helps drivers understand that, oh, this is a place where there's people present, where there's other things present, and it's just not a place for me to go fast. Curb radii, besides shortening distance, also slows drivers. If the curb radii is really wide, you can take that corner at 40 miles an hour and not even slow down, but if it's narrow, you can't. Of course, the issue with curb radii is whether you have a lot of truck traffic and whether they need to make that corner and whether you're leaving them enough room. But typically, again, if it's a low enough speed place, the truck, even if they have to wait for a queue to swing wide and get around the corner, if trucks aren't there, typically you can still do that. So pay attention to the curb radii. So these are just other things that you can think about. Another way to slow traffic is to reduce those lane widths, but also create other things. And the good thing about a road conversion or a road diet is that it will take a facility that doesn't have any space for bikes, maybe is a constrained right-of-way in terms of land and what's developed around it, and so you're probably not likely to widen the full right-of-way and add sidewalks and bike lanes, and use that space differently. So I don't have the before picture here, I'm sorry, but the before picture is that there's a yellow stripe down the middle and 2 travel lanes. There's no bike lane. Those travel lanes are right next to this attached sidewalk. It's not a very safe or comfortable place to walk. We've got lots of those in this community. We're right in the middle of converting one of those, Emerald Street, on the bench to 3 lanes with 1 travel lane in each direction, a bike lane on both sides, and then the sidewalks. And the bike lanes aren't just for bikes, they're for both the pedestrians and drivers, because now the pedestrians have a buffer, and the drivers also, if you know, heaven forbid they're distracted, unfortunately we have a few of those, and they were to travel out of lane, unless there's a bicycle right there when they do it, they're probably not going to hit anybody. So, and you know, even better if there are candles, if there's enough room to put a buffer and candles, because then they actually see those if they start to wander and can correct. But regardless, it typically does not slow traffic. So, you know, the average person on the street would think, well, you're taking a lane away, of course it's gonna make my trip harder and more difficult and probably slower. But because, remember, this was a 2-lane road, and what does this lane do? It turns into all these driveways. And how many times you're going to get stuck between that turning movement, behind that turning movement, while the other lane's going. So in essence, you're not taking a full travel lane away, because that travel lane usually doesn't work really well as a travel lane anyway. And studies have shown that these facilities have almost as much capacity as a 4-lane and are much safer. The other thing that happens on a 4-lane is that one we talked about, where you have 2 lanes and the person in one lane blocks the view of the person in the next lane. You also have rear end collisions. You have all kinds of things happening on 4 lanes that you don't have happening on these. I didn't show a full roundabout, but this is a traffic circle, and these kinds of things can just cue drivers again that, hey, this isn't a place for me to just go through and go fast, but it's somewhere I have to pay attention. I have to go pretty slow to enter this thing, and if I'm a pedestrian now, that distance crossing is really short. And oh, by the way, I can't have a T-bone collision with anybody. I can only have that low-speed angled collision, which is a lot less likely to cause injury, especially cause death. Things we don't think about is, and Ryan talked about this, we treat driveways sometimes like intersections. You don't want to do that, because you create a false sense of security for drivers, and you create a barrier for pedestrians. It's best to continue the sidewalk across that, continue the concrete treatment. It's best to keep the concrete, if you can, at level and not make it even dip. Sometimes that's not possible, but if you do make it dip, don't have it be a slide slope, have it go straight down, level, and then back up. Because if you treat it, if you put the side slope here, go try to wheel that in a wheelchair or on a scooter or something else. Doesn't work very well. The other thing this does is keeps the pedestrian more visible by putting them up instead of down. So if you can, like I say, if you can keep it on level and then dip, that's always the best thing to do. So here's an example of one in our region that actually works pretty well. In this case, you also have the little island out here that, again, just slows drivers down. A lot of people say, well, let's just build a bridge. Why not? Come on, that'll be great. Then we won't have these conflicts. Studies show that the bridges don't get used very much unless there's really no other choice, or unless it's in a location where that really is the only way to get across. So there's one in Caldwell that crosses the freeway. And guess what? That one gets used, and it's a good one, and it should be there. There's one on Overland in Boise at a school, and I don't know that I've ever seen anyone in it, but I've seen a lot of kids crossing the street at street level, because the bridge has, I don't know, a quarter of a mile ramp to get up it and down it. Nobody wants to do that just to cross the street. The other thing is they're really expensive. They create the time delay for the pedestrians, and so unless there's really no other choice, no other way to get the pedestrian across the street, they're not a great solution. I've heard recently folks saying, well, maybe in an urban area if you have an escalator or you have an elevator, but it still changes the perception of what's going on in the street. It's sending a cue to drivers that, hey, this street space is for you and not for pedestrians, so don't pay attention to pedestrians. To me, that's the other really bad thing about them. So, short crossing distance, improved visibility, slow vehicle speed, and any other questions?